How to end anxiety and overthinking in a Stoic way. Stoic mindset for mental peace. The mind that cannot rest. You know the feeling. It is 3 in the morning and your body is exhausted, but your mind refuses to stop. It replays the conversation you had 2 days ago. It rehearses the argument you might have next week. It builds entire catastrophes out of events that have not happened and may never happen. You lie in the dark, not resting, but imprisoned. And the worst part is not the exhaustion. The worst part is the shame. The voice that says you should be able to control this. The voice that asks why everyone else seems fine while you are here, trapped in a loop you did not choose and cannot seem to exit. Anxiety does not announce itself politely. It does not knock on the door and wait. It moves in quietly, rearranges the furniture, and before you realize it, you are living in a house that no longer feels like yours. Your thoughts, which were once tools, become weapons. The mind that was designed to protect you becomes the very source of your torment. And every strategy you have tried, the breathing, the journaling, the distraction, the sheer force of will, has delivered temporary relief at best and exhausted you further at worst. There is a reason for that. Not because you are weak, not because something is fundamentally broken in you, but because every strategy you have tried has been aimed at managing the symptoms rather than dismantling the architecture that produces them. You have been treating the smoke and ignoring the fire. You have been negotiating with the loop instead of understanding what powers it. Consider how much of your life has been spent in this state. Not in genuine crisis, but in the anticipation of crisis. Not in actual danger, but in the mental simulation of danger that never quite arrives in the form your mind designed for it. Days that were objectively manageable, even good, experienced as unbearable because the mind was somewhere else entirely, rehearsing a future that existed nowhere but in its own anxious projections. That is not a small thing. That is a life, or significant portions of one, spent in a prison with no walls and no guards, only the unchallenged authority of your own unexamined thoughts. The cruelty of overthinking is that it wears the costume of productivity. It feels like preparation. It feels like responsibility. The mind that will not stop spinning convinces itself that it is solving something, that if it just runs the scenario one more time, one more variation, one more worst-case permutation, it will finally arrive at the answer that makes everything safe. But the answer never comes, because the question was never real. It was a phantom constructed by a nervous system that does not know the difference between imagined threat and actual threat, and that has been running on high alert for so long that it has forgotten what calm feels like. This is not a video about coping. Coping implies permanent management of a permanent problem. What you are about to encounter is something far more radical, a complete restructuring of the mental framework that generates anxiety in the first place. The Stoics did not cope with their suffering. They dissolved it. Not by becoming emotionless, not by pretending the world was not hard, but by seeing, with absolute clarity, the precise mechanism by which suffering is produced inside the human mind, and then choosing deliberately and consistently to refuse it the conditions it needs to survive. The philosopher who was once a slave, the emperor who ruled the known world, the statesman who faced exile and death with the same tranquility with which he faced a calm afternoon. These men had nothing in common except one thing. They had found the source. And what they found was not a technique. It was a truth so simple that it is almost offensive, and so powerful that once you genuinely grasp it, nothing that happens outside of you will ever be able to touch what is happening inside you again. Stay with this. What follows will not always be comfortable, but it will be real. And in a world flooded with false comfort, reality is the rarest and most valuable gift anyone can offer you. What the Stoics saw, that modern psychology still misses. Modern approaches to anxiety have produced extraordinary tools, therapies, frameworks, medications, cognitive models, all of them genuinely useful, all of them reflecting decades of serious scientific inquiry. And yet, for millions of people who have access to all of these resources, the anxiety persists. It adapts. It finds new forms. Because most of what passes for mental health treatment in the modern world is fundamentally reactive. It responds to the symptoms after they have already appeared. It helps you manage what you are feeling. It does not always ask the deeper question, why does the mind produce these feelings at all? And what is the foundational belief system that keeps regenerating them? The Stoics asked that question first. They asked it with a rigor and a clarity that has not been surpassed in 2,000 years of philosophical inquiry. And their answer was not what most people expect. It was not change your environment. It was not improve your relationships. It was not even practice self-care. Their answer was this: you suffer because of what you believe about the things that happen to you, not because of the things themselves. This is the insight that Marcus Aurelius captured in the opening books of his Meditations, with a phrase that has echoed through centuries. The quality of your life is determined by the quality of your thoughts about it, not the events, not the people, not the circumstances, the thoughts, the judgments, the evaluations that the mind silently attaches to everything it encounters, so automatically and so rapidly that most people never even notice they are happening. This is not positive thinking. Positive thinking says, tell yourself the situation is good, even when it is not. Stoicism says something completely different. It says, examine the situation with radical precision, strip away every emotional assumption, every catastrophic projection, every demand that things be different than they are, and see what actually remains. What remains, almost always, is far less threatening than what your mind had constructed around it. Epictetus taught this in the most direct terms possible. In his discourses, he wrote with the clarity of someone who had lived at the absolute bottom of social hierarchy, and still found within that position a form of freedom that his masters could never touch. His central teaching was not that the world is kind. It is often not. His teaching was that the world's cruelty cannot reach the part of you that decides what it means. What makes the Stoic diagnosis so penetrating is its refusal to locate the problem in the world. So many frameworks for dealing with anxiety are built on the implicit assumption that if the circumstances were different, the anxiety would resolve. If the relationship were healthier, the career more stable, the finances more secure, the body more reliable, then peace would follow. The Stoics looked at this assumption and rejected it entirely, not out of indifference to circumstances, but out of a precise understanding that the relationship between circumstances and suffering is not causal. It is interpretive. Two people can face identical circumstances and experience entirely different internal states, because the suffering is not in the situation. It is in the meaning assigned to the situation, and meaning is always, without exception, a product of the mind. This insight does not diminish pain. It does not tell you that your difficulty is not real, or that your suffering is your fault in some punishing sense. What it does is return to you the authorship of your own experience. It relocates the source of both your suffering and your peace in the only place where you actually have the power to do something about it, inside yourself. That gap, between what happens and what you decide it means, is where Stoicism lives. It is also where anxiety is either born or killed. Everything else in this video flows from that single point. Remember it, because by the time you reach the end, you will understand not just what it means intellectually, but how to live inside it as a daily, practical, transformative reality. The dichotomy that changes everything. Epictetus begins his most accessible work, the Enchiridion, with a statement so fundamental that it is easy to read past it without grasping its full weight. He writes, in the translation closest to the original Greek, "Some things are in our control, and others not." That is the entire sentence, 8 words. And within those 8 words is the most precise and practical tool for ending anxiety that any human mind has ever produced. The dichotomy of control is not a suggestion. It is not a comforting platitude. It is a logical framework as rigorous and as demanding as any mathematical proof that divides all of reality into 2 categories and assigns a completely different relationship to each. In our control. Our judgments, our desires, our actions, our responses, our values. The way we choose to interpret and engage with the world. Not in our control. Everything else. Other people's opinions. Other people's choices. The economy. Your health. The past. The future. The weather. Reputation. The outcome of your work. Other people's moods. The news. Read that second list again. Every single item on it is something that the anxious mind obsesses over. Every single item on it is something that the anxious mind treats as both deeply important and deeply threatening. And every single item on it is, by Stoic definition, outside the domain of your control entirely. This is not pessimism. This is mathematics. You cannot control other people's choices any more than you can control the orbit of the moon. The energy you spend trying is not noble effort. It is, in the precise Stoic meaning of the word, irrational. Now consider what this means in practice. Every time your mind begins to spiral about what someone might think of you, the dichotomy asks, is this within my control? No. Then it does not belong in your mental space. Every time your mind rehearses an argument that has not happened, the dichotomy asks, is the other person's response within my control? No. Then the rehearsal is not preparation. It is suffering in advance. Every time your mind catastrophizes about a future outcome, the dichotomy asks, is that outcome within your control? Partially, perhaps, but only the part that involves your actions and choices, not the results themselves. The practical exercise is this. When anxiety arises, do not fight it. Do not suppress it. Instead, apply the dichotomy immediately. Ask with genuine intellectual honesty, what in this situation is actually within my control? What is not? Then release everything in the second category. Not with resignation, but with the quiet authority of someone who understands that holding on to what they cannot change is not strength but self-inflicted torment. It is worth sitting with the specific texture of what this release feels like, because it is often misunderstood. It is not indifference. The Stoic who releases concern about an uncontrollable outcome is not someone who does not care about what happens. They care deeply about what they do, about the quality of their effort, about the integrity of their response. What they refuse to do is attach their peace to a result that lies beyond their power. That refusal is not coldness. It is one of the most sophisticated and demanding forms of emotional intelligence ever developed. Epictetus was once asked by a student how to deal with the fear of death, the ultimate uncontrollable. His answer was characteristic in its directness. Death is not in your control. What you do with the life preceding it is. Direct your attention accordingly. The student who heard that was not being dismissed. They were being handed the most powerful cognitive tool available to a mortal being. The complete and unconditional redirection of concern toward the domain where concern can actually produce something of value. This practice, done consistently, does not produce passivity. It produces clarity. It frees enormous amounts of mental energy from the futile project of controlling the uncontrollable and redirects that energy toward the only place it can ever produce genuine results. Your own perception, your own choices, your own character. That is where your power actually lives. That is where the Stoics found theirs. Why your brain loops. And how to break the circuit. Overthinking is not stupidity. It is not weakness. It is not even, at its core, a disorder. It is a survival mechanism running in the wrong context. The human brain evolved in an environment of genuine physical danger where the ability to anticipate problems, rehearse responses, and model future scenarios was a matter of life and death. The mind that could imagine the predator around the corner before it arrived was the mind that survived. You are the descendant of the most anxious members of our species. Your brain is doing exactly what it was built to do. The problem is that the predators have changed, and the brain has not received the update. In a world of social judgment, financial uncertainty, relationship complexity, and information overload, the threat detection system that once scanned for lions now scans for everything. And because modern threats are ambiguous, social, and rarely fully resolvable, the loop never gets a clean signal to stop. The predator never clearly goes away. So the mind keeps scanning, keeps rehearsing, keeps building models of catastrophe that feel like preparation, but are actually perpetual alarm. The key insight, the one that breaks the circuit, is this. The loop is not solving anything. It feels like it is. It has the texture of productive thinking. But examine any overthinking loop honestly, and you will find that it returns to the same point repeatedly, never reaching a resolution, only generating more questions and more fear. It is a car spinning its wheels in mud. The engine is running. The effort is real. But there is no forward movement. The Stoic interruption is not to silence the thought. Trying to not think about something is notoriously counterproductive. The Stoic interruption is to engage the thought with reason rather than emotion. To ask it, what specifically are you afraid of? Is that fear based on what is actually happening or on a projection? If the feared event occurred, what would you actually do? Is it survivable? Is it within your control? Has your mind granted this projected event a certainty it does not actually possess? When you interrogate the loop with these questions, something remarkable happens. The loop cannot answer them, because the loop was never designed to answer questions. It was designed to generate alarm, and alarm, when met with calm, rational inquiry rather than panic, loses its authority. The signal weakens. The circuit breaks. Not because you forced it to stop, but because you refused to feed it the one thing it requires to keep running: unexamined fear. There is a deeper layer to this that is worth examining. The overthinking loop is not random. It tends to circle around specific themes that carry a particular emotional charge: acceptance, safety, control, worth, belonging. These are the themes that evolution wired us to protect most fiercely, because historically they were survival critical. The mind does not loop about things it is genuinely indifferent to. It loops about the things it has decided matter most. And therein lies both the diagnosis and the cure. If you can identify the specific value or need that the loop is protecting, you can address that need directly, through action and philosophy, rather than allowing the loop to address it indirectly, through endless and unproductive rehearsal. Epictetus would have put it this way: the loop continues as long as you believe that running it is doing something useful. The moment you see, clearly and honestly, that it is producing only more anxiety and zero resolution, you have all the rational justification you need to stop following it. The discipline of assent, the refusal to automatically grant authority to every impression the mind generates, is the practice that makes this possible. Not in theory, in the actual moment of the loop. When you feel it beginning, you do not have to go where it leads. This is what the Stoics called the discipline of assent, the practice of not accepting every impression the mind generates as true, urgent, or actionable. You are not required to believe everything your mind tells you. That single realization, applied daily, is the beginning of genuine freedom from overthinking. Marcus Aurelius in The Discipline of the Present. Marcus Aurelius was not a man who had the luxury of a quiet life. He ruled the Roman Empire at one of its most turbulent periods, commanding armies against Germanic invasions while simultaneously managing plagues, political conspiracies, and the crushing weight of absolute power. He sat with generals while battles were being decided, and he sat alone at night, writing to himself in a private journal that was never intended for anyone else's eyes. In those pages which we know today as the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, he returned again and again to a single discipline: the present moment. Not the present moment as a spiritual concept, not as a relaxation technique, as a rigorous, active, almost aggressive mental discipline. In Book 8 of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, he wrote to himself with the directness of a general issuing orders: confine yourself to the present, not the past, which is fixed and beyond alteration; not the future, which does not yet exist and may never exist in the form you are imagining. The present, this breath, this choice, this action. The anatomy of anxiety is almost always temporal. It lives either in the past, in regret, in the replaying of events, in the reconstruction of what should have been said or done, or in the future, in anticipation, in catastrophe modeling, in the projection of current pain into an imaginary permanence. Almost never does anxiety live in the actual present moment, because in the actual present moment most of the time you are simply here, breathing, safe, functional. The discipline Marcus Aurelius practiced was not to ignore the future or the past, but to refuse them residency in the present mind. When a thought about the future arose, he did not follow it. He noted it, applied the dichotomy of control, took whatever present action was warranted, and returned. When a thought about the past arose, he examined it only long enough to extract a practical lesson for present behavior, then released it. What makes this discipline particularly demanding is the mind's extraordinary creativity in justifying its own wandering. It will tell you that worrying about the future is responsible planning, that it would be negligent not to consider every possible negative outcome, that the person who does not rehearse risk is the person who gets blindsided. Marcus Aurelius heard those arguments. He was an emperor. The stakes of his decisions were not abstract, and he still concluded that unproductive rumination dressed as prudence was simply anxiety wearing a respectable costume. The distinction he drew was practical. Take the actions available to you now, in this situation, with the information and resources you have, then return to the present. Planning is present-focused when it results in concrete action. It becomes anxiety the moment it loops without producing anything actionable. That boundary, between useful foresight and compulsive catastrophizing, is exactly where the discipline of present attention operates. In Book 2, paragraph 14 of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, he asks himself, "What is there in this that is intolerable and past endurance?" He is not asking sarcastically. He is asking as a genuine rational examination of the present moment. And the answer, almost always when stripped of projection and catastrophic narrative, is not much. The present moment itself is usually manageable. It is the imagined future attached to it that feels unbearable. Try this today. Every time your mind leaves the present, note where it goes, past or future, useful examination or spiral, then bring it back. Not with force, but with the same calm authority that Marcus Aurelius exercised at the head of an empire. The present moment is the only place where anything can actually be done. It is also, for those who learn to inhabit it fully, the only place where peace is available. Seneca's Letter to the Anxious Mind. Seneca wrote to his friend Lucilius with the urgency of a man who knew time was short and truth was urgent. His letters to Lucilius are not academic dispatches. They are alive. They are the correspondence of someone who had lived at the highest levels of Roman power, who had survived exile, who had watched fortune reverse itself with stunning cruelty, and who had arrived at a set of conclusions that he felt compelled to share before time ran out. One of his most striking observations appears in Letter 1 of the Letters to Lucilius, and it cuts with the precision of a blade. Everything is alien to us. Time alone is ours. And yet, he continues, it is precisely time that we squander most carelessly. We guard our money. We guard our property. We guard our reputation. But time, the one thing that is genuinely, irreversibly ours, we give away freely to worry, to distraction, to the imagined demands of a future that may never arrive. Anxiety is, at its neurological core, a temporal distortion. It takes the mind out of the present and transports it to a future that exists nowhere except in the imagination. And the imagination, left unexamined, is remarkably bad at predicting the future. Research consistently shows that humans are poor forecasters of their own emotional states. The events we dread most rarely feel as catastrophic when they actually occur as they did in our anticipation of them. The suffering we experience in the mental rehearsal of disaster is frequently far greater than the suffering we would experience in the actual event. Seneca saw this with perfect clarity 2,000 years before the research existed to confirm it. He wrote in Letter 13 of the Letters to Lucilius that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. That is not a metaphor. That is a precise description of what anxiety does. It borrows suffering from a future that it cannot actually predict, charges you full price in the present, and then watches as the feared event either does not occur at all or proves far less devastating than advertised. What Seneca understood with particular acuity was the compounding nature of this temporal theft. One anxious hour does not simply cost you 1 hour. It costs you the energy that was depleted by the anxiety itself, the decision-making quality that suffers when the mind is running on alarm, the presence you could not offer to the people, and moments that were actually in front of you, and the accumulated physical toll of a nervous system held at high alert for hours, days, or years on end. Seneca was not being dramatic when he insisted on the urgency of reclaiming time. He was being a precise accountant of what anxiety actually costs. He also wrote in letter 77 of the letters to Lucilius about the difference between a long life and a full one. A life consumed by anxiety about the future, he argued, is not a long life well used. It is a short life experienced multiple times over, because each imagined catastrophe is lived through in advance, draining the vitality that belongs to the present. The Stoic goal was not longevity for its own sake. It was the full inhabitation of the time that actually exists, rather than the compulsive pre-suffering of time that has not yet arrived and may never arrive in the form feared. The Senecan prescription is not to stop thinking about the future. It is to reclaim your relationship with time, to spend your mental hours as carefully as a man who knows he has only a finite number of them left, which is exactly what every human being is, whether they acknowledge it or not. When you catch yourself spending present time worrying about a future that you cannot control, ask yourself the question Seneca implicitly poses in every letter he wrote. Is this how I choose to spend the only thing that is truly mine? The answer, once you sit with it honestly, changes everything. Amor, Fati, the art of wanting what is. There is a concept in Stoic philosophy that sounds, on first encounter, almost offensive in its demands. Amor, Fati, the love of fate, not the acceptance of fate, not the resigned tolerance of fate, the love of it, the active, unconditional embrace of everything that happens, exactly as it happens, not in spite of what it is, but because of what it is. Most people encounter this idea and immediately object. Love the things that hurt me? Love the loss, the failure, the humiliation, the betrayal? That is not philosophy. That sounds like denial, or masochism. But that objection misunderstands what Amor Fati actually requires. It does not require you to pretend that painful things are pleasant. It does not require you to suppress genuine grief or manufacture false enthusiasm for suffering. What it requires is something far more psychologically sophisticated. The recognition that reality, as it actually is at this moment, is the only thing that exists, and that your resistance to it, while understandable, is not changing it. It is only adding your suffering to it. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Book 4 of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, "Accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate brings you together, and do so with all your heart." That is not passivity. That is a radical act of psychological sovereignty. When you stop pouring energy into demanding that what happened did not happen, or that what is were different from what it is, something in the mind becomes very still. The war ends, not because you won, but because you chose to stop fighting a battle you were never going to win. The anatomy of resistance is worth examining closely, because it is so pervasive that most people experience it as natural rather than as a choice. Resistance is the mental posture of arguing with reality. It is the sustained internal insistence that a fact should not be a fact, that an event should not have occurred, that a person should have been different, that the situation should have unfolded otherwise. And it feels righteous. It feels like integrity. It feels like refusing to capitulate to injustice. But in most cases, it is none of those things. It is simply pain prolonged by the refusal to acknowledge what is. Amor Fati does not ask you to approve of everything that happens. It asks you to stop wasting energy on the disapproval of what cannot be changed. The diagnosis has arrived. The relationship has ended. The opportunity has passed. The mistake was made. These are facts. The Stoic moves through them with the efficiency of someone who understands that the only relevant question now is not why this happened or whether it should have, but what the appropriate response is from this point forward. The practical dimension of Amor Fati is this. Every time you notice yourself mentally arguing with reality, you are in the grip of resistance. That resistance is the primary engine of your suffering. The situation is what it is. The event happened. What you do next, how you respond, what meaning you assign, what action you take. These are yours. The event itself is not. The moment you shift from "this should not be" to "this is, and here is how I choose to meet it," the anxiety that was feeding on your resistance begins to starve. Not immediately, not completely, but measurably, perceptibly, genuinely. This is not theory. This is the lived experience of every person who has ever practiced this discipline with seriousness and consistency. Amor, Fati is the Stoics' answer to the question that haunts every anxious mind. What do I do with the things I cannot change? You change your relationship to them. Completely. And in doing so, you discover that the peace you were waiting for the world to deliver was always within your authority to create. The Premeditation of Adversity. There is a practice in Stoicism so counterintuitive that most people, when they first encounter it, assume it must make anxiety worse. It is called Premeditatio Malorum, the premeditation of adversity, the deliberate, voluntary mental rehearsal of what could go wrong, not as a form of pessimism, not as a form of morbid indulgence, but as one of the most precise and effective anxiety-neutralizing tools ever devised. Here is the logic. Anxiety feeds on the unknown. It is the mind's response to uncertainty, to the gap between what is and what might be. The imagination fills that gap with catastrophe, and because the catastrophe is imagined rather than experienced, the mind has no evidence that it is survivable. It only has the alarm, only the anticipatory dread, only the formless fear of something that exists nowhere except as a projection. Premeditatio Malorum collapses that gap deliberately and methodically. Instead of waiting for the fear to ambush you, you walk toward it. You sit down quietly and ask, what is the worst realistic outcome here? Not the most dramatic, not the most theatrical, but the most honest, most probable worst case. Then you examine it. You ask, if this happened, what would I actually do? What resources do I have? What have I survived before? What would remain after this? Seneca practiced this daily. He would begin each morning by visualizing potential adversities, the loss of a friendship, a financial reversal, a health challenge, an undeserved accusation. Not to become afraid, but to arrive at a state of prepared equanimity. If the feared event occurred, he had already walked through it mentally and confirmed his ability to endure it with dignity. If it did not occur, he faced the day with the additional gratitude of someone who understood what they still possessed. There is a subtlety in this practice that distinguishes it sharply from ordinary worry. Ordinary worry is passive and reactive. It is dragged into scenarios by fear, and it circles them without exit. Premeditatio Malorum is active and deliberate. You choose the scenario. You choose the timing. You bring your full rational capacity to bear on it, not as a helpless observer, but as a philosopher conducting an examination. The difference in the interior experience is profound. Worry disempowers. Premeditation, done correctly, does the opposite. Marcus Aurelius practiced a version of this every morning. Before the demands of the empire descended on him, he would remind himself, as recorded in the opening of Book 2 of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, that he would encounter difficult people, frustrating circumstances, ingratitude, and opposition. He did not list these things to generate dread. He listed them to arrive at his day already oriented, already having chosen his response in advance, already carrying the Stoic framework that would allow him to meet each difficulty with equanimity rather than shock. The modern application is immediate and practical. Before a difficult conversation, visualize it going badly and ask yourself what you would do. Before a high-stakes presentation, visualize the technical failure and ask yourself how you would respond. Before a medical result, visualize the worst diagnosis and ask yourself what your first steps would be. In every case, the exercise does the same thing. It transforms the unknown from a source of limitless dread into a specific, manageable scenario that you have already begun to navigate. The anxiety that remains after this exercise is smaller, always, because it is no longer feeding on the infinite darkness of the imagined worst. It is contending with something specific, something real enough to be examined, something that your rational mind can actually work with. And the rational mind, given something specific to work with, almost always finds a path through. You are not your thoughts. Epictetus taught something that sounds simple and reveals itself, upon examination, to be one of the most liberating insights in all of human philosophy. He taught that there is a difference, and a real, meaningful, consequential difference, between what appears to your mind and what you choose to do with what appears. He called these appearances phantasiae, impressions, and he taught with absolute consistency that no impression has authority over you unless you grant it authority. This is the Stoic doctrine of assent, the idea that between the arising of a thought and your response to it, there is a gap, a moment of genuine freedom, a space in which you are not yet committed, not yet swept away, not yet defined by what the mind has produced. And in that gap, the entire practice of Stoic philosophy is concentrated. Most people live as if their thoughts are themselves, as if the anxious thought is the person, as if the catastrophic projection is the reality, as if the self-critical voice is the truth. They do not experience thoughts as passing events in the mind. They experience them as the mind itself, as the self itself. And when the mind produces fear, they become fear. When the mind produces shame, they become shame. When the mind produces the 3 in the morning loop, they are the loop, helpless, and identified. The Stoic practice of de-identification from thoughts is not a spiritual exercise. It is a rational one. When a thought arises, you observe it. You note its content. You ask, with genuine intellectual honesty, is this thought based on what is actually happening, or on an impression that I have not yet examined? Is this thought within the category of things I can act on, or is it a projection onto the category of things I cannot control? Is this thought asking me to do something useful, or is it simply generating alarm? Then, based on those answers, you either act or you release. If the thought points to something actionable within your control, you act. If it points to something outside your control, you decline to follow it. Not with suppression, not with force, but with the calm authority of someone who understands that a thought is not a command, and that the self is not defined by whatever happens to arise in the mind on a Tuesday morning at 3 o'clock. The depth of this teaching becomes clearer when you consider what Epictetus understood about the nature of identity. He did not define the self as the sum of its mental events. He defined the self as the faculty that evaluates and responds to those events. The self is not the stream of thoughts. The self is the one who decides what to do with them. That distinction is not merely philosophical. It is the architecture of freedom. Because if you are the stream, you are helpless. If you are the one who evaluates the stream, you have all the authority you need. This has an immediate practical consequence for the experience of intrusive thoughts. The dark, violent, shameful, or catastrophic thoughts that arise uninvited in many anxious minds and generate enormous secondary shame. The Stoic position is that the arising of a thought is not a statement about your character. Thoughts arise from the nervous system, from memory, from association, from evolutionary programming. The thought you did not ask for is not a verdict. What you do with it, whether you follow it, amplify it, give it authority, or simply observe it and release it, that is where character is expressed. This practice is not passive. It is not detachment in the cold, disconnected sense. It is the deepest possible form of engagement with your own mental life, one in which you are the observer and the chooser rather than the helpless passenger. That distinction, practiced consistently, is what the Stoics meant by freedom. Not freedom from circumstances, freedom from the uncritical domination of your own mind. The inner citadel, building the mind, no circumstance can invade. Marcus Aurelius used a specific and deliberate metaphor to describe the properly trained Stoic mind. He called it a citadel, not a comfortable home, not a pleasant garden, a fortification, a structure built with intention and maintained with discipline, capable of withstanding assault from every direction without surrendering its interior integrity. The image is instructive because it is honest. Life is not peaceful. Circumstances are not cooperative. People are not always kind, and the world is not organized around your well-being. The Stoic does not pretend otherwise. The Stoic builds a citadel precisely because they understand the nature of the terrain they are moving through. But here's the crucial distinction between the Stoic citadel and what most people understand as emotional armoring or psychological defense. The citadel is not built to keep feeling out. It is built to keep reason in. There is a profound difference between a mind that has walled itself off from experience out of fear and a mind that engages fully with experience while maintaining an unshakable interior orientation. One is a prison. The other is a fortress that the inhabitant chose to construct and knows how to inhabit with dignity. The construction of the inner citadel is not a single act. It is a daily practice. It is built through the consistent application of every principle explored in this video. The dichotomy of control, the discipline of the present, the practice of de-identification from thought, the embrace of reality as it is. Each time you apply one of these principles under genuine pressure, you lay another stone. Each time you choose reason over reaction, you reinforce a wall. Each time you refuse to grant an external event authority over your internal state, you deepen the foundation. Marcus Aurelius returned to this metaphor repeatedly in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius because he needed it, not as an abstraction, but as a practical anchor. When the empire's demands were overwhelming, when those around him failed him, when the plague took those he cared for, he returned again and again to the interior space that no emperor, no enemy, and no catastrophe could reach. Not because he felt no pain, because he had built something inside himself that pain could not destroy. The process of building this citadel has a quality that is often missed in popular discussions of Stoicism. It is not a process of hardening. The citadel metaphor is sometimes taken to imply a kind of emotional fortification that is really just numbness in philosophical clothing. But Marcus Aurelius wept, he grieved, he felt the weight of his losses with the full human capacity for pain. The citadel did not prevent feeling. It prevented feeling from becoming the final word. It ensured that after the grief, after the anger, after the fear, there was still a rational center that could evaluate, choose, and act with integrity. That is what you are building. Not indifference, not numbness, not the absence of feeling. A place inside yourself that remains yours, no matter what. A place from which you can feel everything, respond to everything, engage with everything, without being defined or destroyed by any of it. That is the citadel, and its construction begins with the next choice you make. Desire, expectation, and the source of all suffering. If you trace any experience of chronic anxiety back to its source, you will find, almost without exception, a frustrated desire or an unmet expectation. The anxiety about the job is rooted in the desire for security and the expectation that a specific outcome will deliver it. The anxiety about the relationship is rooted in the desire to be loved in a particular way and the expectation that the other person will fulfill that need. The anxiety about health is rooted in the desire for permanence in a body that is, by its nature, impermanent. The Stoics were among the first thinkers in history to map this connection with precision. Epictetus, in the Discourses, stated it plainly. Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life. That is not resignation. That is a fundamental restructuring of the desire apparatus itself. The key distinction is this. The Stoics did not teach the elimination of desire. They taught the redirection of desire toward virtue, toward excellence of character, toward the quality of your actions rather than the outcomes of your actions, because the quality of your actions is within your control. The outcome is not. And desire aimed at what is within your control never produces anxiety, because it cannot be frustrated by anything outside yourself. This is why the Stoic path to mental peace is not about managing anxiety after it arises. It is about restructuring the desire system so that the conditions for anxiety are removed from the ground up. When you genuinely stop requiring a specific external outcome in order to be at peace, the anxiety that was attached to that requirement disappears. Not gradually, immediately, because the fuel is gone. There is a clarification worth making here, because the Stoic teaching on desire is frequently misread as an endorsement of ambitionless passivity. The Stoics were not passive people. Marcus Aurelius ran an empire. Seneca wrote prolifically and engaged intensely with political life. Epictetus built a school that shaped generations of thinkers. What distinguished their engagement from anxiety-driven striving was the specific object of their desire. They desired to act well. They desired to think clearly. They desired to embody virtue in every situation they encountered. These are desires that no external event can frustrate, because they depend entirely on what the person themselves chooses to do. Compare that to the desire for a specific outcome, a promotion, a particular relationship, a certain level of recognition, and the structural difference becomes immediately clear. The outcome-focused desire is a hostage to the world. It can be granted or denied by circumstances entirely beyond your control. The virtue-focused desire cannot. It is yours as long as you choose it. And it is that inviolable ownership of your own aspirations that the Stoics understood as the foundation of unshakable peace. The practical exercise here is honest inventory. Look at the things that produce the most anxiety in your life. For each one, ask, what do I want that I am afraid of not getting? Then ask, is this want directed at something within my control or at an outcome, a person, or a circumstance beyond it? If it is the latter, the Stoic question is not how to get it, but how to redirect the energy of that want toward the only thing that can never be taken from you, the way you choose to act, the character you choose to embody, the person you choose to be in this moment, regardless of what results. That is where genuine desire leads, not to anxiety, but to the quiet, grounded, unassailable satisfaction of a life lived according to your own deepest values. That is what the Stoics meant when they said virtue is sufficient for happiness. Not that pain does not exist, but that nothing external is required for the deepest form of human flourishing. The Stoic practice of voluntary discomfort. There is an aspect of Stoic practice that rarely makes it into the inspirational quotes and morning routine content. It is not comfortable to talk about, which is precisely why it is important. The Stoics practiced voluntary discomfort, deliberately, regularly. As a core component of their philosophical discipline, Seneca would periodically wear rough clothing, eat minimal food, and sleep on a simple mat. Not because he lacked the wealth for better, but because he wanted to prove something to himself. He wrote about this practice in letter 18 of the letters to Lucilius with characteristic directness. Set aside a certain number of days during which you will be content with the cheapest and coarsest fare, with rough and harsh clothing, and ask yourself, is this what I feared? He was not seeking suffering for its own sake. He was conducting a controlled experiment in the limits of his own anxiety. What Seneca discovered, and what every person who has practiced this discipline seriously will confirm, is that the anticipation of discomfort is almost always more painful than the discomfort itself. The mind inflates what it fears. It adds layers of meaning, social judgment, projected permanence, and catastrophic narrative to experiences that, when actually encountered, turn out to be entirely survivable. The rough clothing is just rough clothing. The sparse meal is just a sparse meal, and the person who has experienced both without collapse carries with them afterward a form of confidence that comfort cannot produce. This matters for anxiety in a direct and practical way. A significant portion of modern anxiety is not about specific threats but about the general terror of discomfort itself. People are anxious not because catastrophe is likely, but because they have become convinced, through years of comfort-seeking and avoidance, that they cannot bear difficulty, that they are fragile, that any significant disruption to their current conditions will be unbearable. Voluntary discomfort disproves this belief at the experiential level, not by telling you that you are strong, by giving you evidence. Small, deliberate, chosen exposures to inconvenience, cold, hunger, difficulty, rejection, and challenge accumulate into a reservoir of self-knowledge that the anxious mind cannot argue with, because it is not theoretical. It happened. You went through it. You are still here. There is a particular form of modern anxiety that voluntary discomfort addresses with exceptional precision, the anxiety that comes from dependency. When your peace depends on specific comforts, a certain level of income, a particular relationship status, a specific amount of social approval, a reliable technological environment. You are, in the Stoic view, living as a hostage to those comforts, not because they are bad, but because you have never tested yourself without them. The moment they are threatened, the anxiety is not just about the loss of the comfort itself. It is about the terrifying possibility that you cannot function without it. Voluntary discomfort answers that terror with direct empirical evidence, before the comfort is involuntarily removed. The practice does not require dramatic gestures. A cold shower in the morning, a day of deliberate simplicity, a difficult conversation you have been avoiding, a period of voluntary solitude, a week without a comfort you depend on. Each of these, done consciously and in the Stoic spirit of honest self-examination, adds a new data point to your self-knowledge. I can endure this. I am not as fragile as my anxiety claimed. My peace does not depend on favorable conditions. That knowledge, accumulated over time, does not eliminate anxiety, but it shrinks it to a manageable size, because it has been tested and found exaggerated, and the mind, once it has that information, cannot fully reconstruct the fear with the same intensity it once had. Speaking to yourself, like a Stoic, there is a conversation happening inside you right now. There is always a conversation happening inside you, a voice that narrates, evaluates, remembers, anticipates, judges, and often condemns. Most people are barely aware of this voice. They experience it not as something they are doing, but as something that is simply happening, as automatic and as unchosen as breathing. But unlike breathing, the content of that inner speech is not fixed by biology. It is shaped by habit, by assumption, by the quality of attention you bring to it. And it is, in the Stoic view, one of the most consequential things about your life. Marcus Aurelius addressed himself in his meditations with a directness that is almost startling. He did not console himself. He did not flatter himself. He spoke to himself as a trusted friend who happened to be a rigorous philosopher, with honesty, with warmth, with no interest in comfortable falsehood. In Book 2, paragraph 4 of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, he writes directly to his own tendency toward distraction and asks himself, with patient firmness, to return to reason and to what the present moment actually requires. Epictetus was even more rigorous. He taught his students that the quality of their inner dialogue was the quality of their philosophical practice. There was no distinction, for Epictetus, between what you said to yourself and who you were becoming. The internal voice was not a commentary on the self. It was the construction of the self, word by word, impression by impression, response by response. The Stoic inner voice has specific characteristics. It is factual rather than dramatic. It describes what is happening without embellishment or catastrophic projection. It is present-focused rather than spiraling. It asks what can be done here, now, with what is available. It is compassionate without being indulgent, acknowledging difficulty without amplifying it into evidence of permanent inadequacy. And it is relentlessly oriented toward virtue, toward asking not why is this happening to me, but who do I want to be in response to this? Consider the difference in practice. The anxious inner voice, when facing a professional failure, says, "This proves I am not good enough. Everyone will see it. The consequences will be permanent. I should have known better. There is no recovering from this." The Stoic inner voice, facing the same failure, says, "This happened. What was within my control and what was not? What can be learned and applied? What is the next appropriate action?" These are two completely different conversations, happening in response to the same event, producing completely different emotional and behavioral outcomes. The gap between them is not talent, it is not intelligence, it is not even optimism. It is a practiced habit of speech, a decision made repeatedly and with increasing automaticity over time, to speak to yourself with the precision and honesty that the Stoics demanded from themselves. Not to be gentle with yourself in the sense of avoiding hard truths, but to be accurate. To neither condemn yourself more than the facts warrant nor protect yourself from the truths you need to hear. Reconstructing the inner voice according to these principles is not an overnight project. It is a practice like any other Stoic discipline. It requires noticing the current voice, examining its content against the standards of reason and the dichotomy of control, and gradually, consistently, replacing dramatic catastrophizing with factual assessment, self-condemnation with honest examination, and projection into an imagined future with clear attention to the actual present. The reward for this work is not silence. It is not the absence of thought. It is the experience of having a mind that is, more often than not, on your side. A mind that speaks to you the way Marcus Aurelius spoke to himself, directly, honestly, with the kind of tough and genuine love that actually helps, rather than the comfortable dishonesty that only delays the reckoning. That is what it sounds like to speak to yourself like a Stoic. And in the long run, how you speak to yourself determines everything. Peace is not given. It is chosen. Everything explored in this video has pointed toward a single, unavoidable conclusion. Not a comfortable one. Not one that allows you to remain a passive recipient of your own life. A demanding conclusion, and precisely because of its demands, a liberating one. Peace is not a destination. It is not a state that arrives when the circumstances finally cooperate, when the right relationships are in place, when the career is settled, when the anxiety stops on its own. The Stoics were unambiguous on this point, and 2,000 years of human history have confirmed it with relentless consistency. If you are waiting for external conditions to deliver internal peace, you will wait forever. Because the conditions will never be exactly right. Because the world was not designed around your requirements. Because even when one source of anxiety resolves, another will take its place, as long as the underlying architecture that generates anxiety remains intact. What the Stoics offered was not a promise that life would become easier. It was a declaration that you are not the helpless product of your circumstances, that within you, regardless of what is happening outside, there exists a faculty, the faculty of reason, the faculty of choice, the faculty of judgment, that no event, no person, and no catastrophe can reach without your permission. That faculty is your freedom. It is also, if you choose to develop it, your peace. Epictetus, who was a slave, found within that condition a freedom that his masters never understood and could never take. Marcus Aurelius, who carried the weight of an empire, found within that burden a stillness that the battlefield and the palace could not disturb. Seneca, who faced exile and ultimately death at the order of a man he had tutored, found within that terminal injustice a dignity that history has honored for 2 millennia. None of them had easy lives. All of them had something far more valuable. They had chosen the orientation of their minds with deliberate, practiced, consistent intention. It is worth naming what that choice actually demands. It demands honesty. The willingness to examine your own beliefs, desires, and assumptions without the protection of comfortable illusions. It demands consistency, not the heroic gesture performed once and then abandoned, but the daily, unglamorous, repeated return to the same principles, under the same pressures. It demands humility, the recognition that you do not yet see clearly, that your judgments are sometimes distorted by emotion, that the practice is never finished and the student is never fully graduated. And it demands courage, not the dramatic courage of the battlefield, but the quieter and more demanding courage of refusing, in the ordinary moments of an ordinary life, to surrender your inner sovereignty to circumstances that were never yours to control. These are not qualities that arrive fully formed. They are built, the same way the inner citadel is built, stone by stone, choice by choice, moment by moment. Each time you catch the loop and interrupt it with reason. Each time you apply the dichotomy of control to something that was pulling your peace away. Each time you speak to yourself with the precision of a Stoic, rather than the dramatic narration of a mind convinced that its suffering is proof of its significance. That choice is available to you, right now. Not after you have read more, practiced longer, achieved more clarity, or suffered less. Now. The anxiety that visits you tonight does not need to be met with the same helpless identification it has always received. The overthinking loop that begins tomorrow morning does not need to be followed to its familiar, exhausting conclusion. The dichotomy of control is available the moment you remember it. The present moment is available the moment you choose it. The inner citadel is accessible the moment you stop looking for peace in places it was never going to be. This is not a call to perfection. The Stoics never claimed perfection, they claimed practice. Daily, imperfect, honest, committed practice. They fell and returned. They forgot and remembered. They were human in every sense of the word, and they still managed to build inner lives of such remarkable stability and depth that their private journals have outlasted their empires. You will forget what you have heard here. That is not failure. That is human. The Stoic response to forgetting is to return, to pick up the practice again without guilt, without dramatic self-condemnation, without the story that forgetting means the practice does not work. It means you are human and that the practice continues. Peace is not something the world owes you. It is not something that happens to you. It is something you build, moment by moment, choice by choice, thought by thought, with the tools that are already in your possession and have always been. The only question the Stoics ever really asked was the one they are asking you now. When do you choose to begin?